Okay, if you will, turn to Hebrews chapter 11. I liked what J.C. Ryle, what he said about this chapter. He said it deserves to be printed in gold letters, and I would agree. I mean, it's very rich, and it has been a joy and a reward for me just studying this, and I hope it has been for you as well. And, it's just I think it's a joy, and just, I don't know, to me it's a privilege and honor just to come before you guys, even just as men. I look at the country and just the world, and, where are the men today? Not just men in general, but the godly men, and I think that's very important that we gather and we open the Word together. We pray for one another. We encourage one another. I think we definitely need that more often. But it has been a great joy for me just being able to teach and study this, and I hope it has been for you as well. So as we've been moving along in this chapter on faith, again, as I mentioned kind of in our prayer time, that our faith more than ever must be evident, in our lives. The world is getting darker, really, with every tick, twist, and turn. But as it is getting darker, we must be getting brighter. Really, daily, we must be getting brighter, and we must be shining more so for Christ than ever before. Just kind of like a battery. You look at a battery and you put it into something and it fully charges it and it's functional. Our faith, it must supercharge our life to action as well. And as you know, a dead battery is what? It's useless. So is a dead faith. It is good for nothing. So by now we know that faith does not sit still. It's not content to hear and then do nothing about it. Faith does not sit on the bench while the action is going on in the field. Much like love, faith is action. Faith is engaged in every call and every play. You could almost say that faith is laced into the pigskin. That everywhere the ball is, that's where faith is, because that's where all the action is. So that must be how our faith works as well. But as we've seen, for there to be work in faith, there must be willing faith. And I mentioned that a few weeks back. And for there to be a life of faith, then there must be choices of faith. Because life is made up of, thousands of choices every day that we make. And choices, they're consequential in our action, and they characterize us, what we do. When choices are powered by faith, though, then that person is characterized by having great faith. And that's what we must do. So tonight we're going to be looking at the choices or decisions of faith, which many times looks foolish to mere man and unpopular among the masses. But we must stand out from the rest of the world. And our prime example tonight, even though we've seen it the last few weeks, is Moses. Moses was a man born in prosperity and prominence. But as we will see, he chose to do away with all of that. And we'll see that in our passage tonight. So there's several, keys or marks of what the choice of faith looks like. And we're going to be looking at verses 23 through 29 tonight. But I guess the first one that we'll look at is the choice of faith in preserving life. The choice of faith in preserving life. And let's go ahead and just read. We'll read one verse at a time and then expound on it. So Hebrews 11:23 says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." And as you can see where we're going to be tonight, we're actually getting out of Genesis, and we're going to be looking at more of Exodus. And though this passage is primarily of the faith and choices of Moses, the first one that we see here is really the faith of Moses' parents. And their names are Amram and Jochebed. And we see their names mentioned in Exodus 6:20. So during this time, when Moses was born, Egypt, it was a time of really persecution and oppression. It was a time of great affliction upon the people of Israel. And as you know, prior to this, the people were prosperous and blessed because they were under the command of who? Joseph, right? It was during the time of severe famine, and we see that in Genesis 47:27. It says, "Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and were fruitful, and became very numerous." Again, this is in Egypt. They're multiplying. They're being blessed. They're prospering, and it's really because it's under the leadership of Joseph. But we even see after the death of Joseph and his brothers, and even after that generation, it says in Exodus 1:7, "The sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." Again, Egypt was filled with the Hebrews, with the Jewish people. But then what happens? What's the major change that takes place that really flips this around? Well, there's a new Pharaoh that came into town. And if you go ahead and turn. We'll be looking back and forth. But yeah, Exodus chapter 1. But in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph." Now that's really key there, because before, the Pharaoh, he knew who Joseph was. And they were in good terms. Again, the Jewish people were growing, they were prospering. But this new Pharaoh, he did not know Joseph, and he did not know just who these people were. And fear kind of came over him. During Joseph's lifetime, after he interpreted Pharaoh's dream, he found favor in the king of Egypt's eyes. And Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt, just below him. But for the new king of Egypt, he didn't know Joseph. What he did know was the people of Israel were growing in great numbers and becoming a great threat to him and his kingdom. He said to his people, and this is back in Exodus chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us and depart from the land." So he saw Israel as a threat. Not they weren't prospering. He saw the number growing as them rising up against him to really take over his kingdom. So what did he do?
Kill the baby boys.
Well, not yet. Not yet. Yeah, he afflicted them with hard labor, and we see that in verse 11. But that wasn't successful, because the more the people were afflicted, what happened? The more they multiplied. Finally, the frustrated and agitated Pharaoh came to the conclusion that if he couldn't stop the growth by rigorous labor, then he would stop it at birth by killing every Jewish boy who was born. And this was the king's edict. In verse 22 of Exodus 1, "Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, 'Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive.'" Now, for most of the Jewish people living in Egypt, they had to be filled with fear, I would imagine. But for one husband and wife, it says back in our text in Hebrews 11:23, they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, we won't read the full account, but let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 3 of Exodus chapter 2. So Exodus chapter 2, 1 through 3. "Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile." So, and it's interesting in this passage here that only the mother's mentioned. Where's the father? Because back in our text in Hebrews, it says both of them, right? It says the parents, Moses' parents. But even though it doesn't mention the father, we believe that he was still there in supporting what his wife was doing. And even though it doesn't really mention him, he was believed to be there by her side in all this. And again, this shows their faith. That in saving a life, they were risking theirs. And that's why our world is so backwards. We don't want to protect life. If it's not according to our convenience, or if it's getting in the way of something, then we just dispose of them. But with Moses' parents, they were risking their lives to save this one child. And look how God used him. Look at all the lives that were taken that could be used greatly for God, but never saw the opportunity or chance of that. Then it says when they could no longer hide him, the precious son, their faith was even expressed more by placing him in a basket and letting him float down the Nile, where he was introduced to Pharaoh's daughter, who would nurture and take care of him as her own son. We also see this in Acts chapter 7, and this is with Stephen with his defense. But he speaks of Moses in Acts chapter 7, verse 21. And after he had been set aside, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son. Now it says here of Moses in our text, he was a beautiful child. Not only to his parents, but to God as well, because in Acts 7:20 it says, it was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God. So not only was he precious in his parents' eyes, but also in God's sight as well. And even though we don't know how much was revealed to Moses' parents, they may have had an idea of what God was going to use, how he was going to use Moses. But regardless, by faith, they refused to follow Pharaoh's command and decided to save this child's life. So we see that the choice of faith is in preserving life. The next one is the choice of faith in refusing the world's prominence. So back in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Growing up, it is vital and important for us to make, really, it is important for the decisions that we make. How one decides on what choices they will make will affect not only them short-term, long-term, but even eternally. It is really key on the choices that we make in growing up. And, while it is important for the child to make right choices, right decisions, it is equally and critically important that parents teach their children the right stuff, that they train them in the way that they should be raised and grow up. Warren Wiersbe rightly said, though godly parents cannot pass on their faith as they do family traits, they can certainly create an atmosphere of faith at home and be examples to their children. A home should be the first school of faith for a child. And, we just don't see that nowadays. And a lot of times, we send them to church, to Sunday school to have their upbringing. But, it has to happen at the home with the parents. Then it says, while Moses was educated in all learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds, that's mentioned in Acts 7:22, he was also taught by his actual biological mother the things of God. Because the amazing thing was, when Pharaoh's daughter found this baby in a basket, she needed someone to nurse him. And by God's providence, it ended up being Moses' mother. Miriam, who was Moses' sister, was nearby when Moses was in the basket going down the Nile. And she was the one to ask the question to Pharaoh's daughter in verse 7, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And this is back in Exodus, back in chapter 2. And then in verses 8 and 9 it says, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go ahead. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. So I think that's just amazing. Even Moses' mother had to give the child away to protect him. She was brought back into his life really at a critical time to really raise him up. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So Moses' mother obviously gave Moses the physical milk he needed, but most certainly also gave him spiritual milk as well. And then it says when Moses had grown up and had come to maturity, and it's something because you would think that he would maybe be at a different stage or a different age, but he was 40 when it says when he had grown up and had come to full maturity. He had a critical decision to make at this point, a decision that would set the course for the rest of his life. Would he devote his loyalty to Egypt, with their rules, their beliefs, as a full-fledged Egyptian, or would he break from that and identify with the Hebrews? And obviously what they were going through was slavery and oppression. Which one would he choose? Well, we know that his flesh and feelings were not the deciding factor, but his faith. Because it says, by faith Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, refuse means to deny, renounce, or reject. Moses had prominence, position, power, but he rejected all of that. Stephen, continuing in his discourse on Moses in verses 23 through 25 of Acts 7, said, "But when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian." And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. So even at this point, Moses, he's come to the realization that God's going to use him somehow in this. But for the rest of the Hebrews, Israel, they just don't see it. They don't understand it. Even before his encounter with God at Horeb, the mountain of God, and before the bush was burned with fire, Moses knew he had a mission from God to save the people from their bondage and affliction. Again, the people didn't understand, but Moses did. So refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, Moses chose instead, as it says in verse 25, back in Hebrews, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So the next choice of faith is in rejecting the world's pleasures. Moses chose endurance over enjoyment, of ill treatment rather than pleasure. Again, he had prominence, but he gave it up. He had a plethora of pleasures to enjoy, but he didn't give in. And as we all know, and as we even see here in our text, sin is often fun, enjoyable, and pleasurable, right? I mean, if it wasn't, no one would do it. I mean, it's obvious. But we also know that sin is a great evil in the sight of God. And I think a good example of this is with Joseph. If you remember, when Joseph was in Egypt, Potiphar's wife continually came to him and said, "Lie with me." But he continued to reject that. And he even said to her, "How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" That's how he saw it. And you can imagine the pressure continually, daily, that he's getting word from this woman, to lie with her, but he refused, and eventually he had to run. He got out of there. He didn't stay for a second. He ran and got out of there. So sin is evil in God's sight, and we know that. Sin also, though, passes away, both in desire and death. After Ammon violated his sister Tamar in 2 Samuel 13:14, it says, he hated her with a very great hatred. For the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Ammon said to her, "Get up, go away." Sin often, it digs for an entrance by any means. But once it enters and does its bidding, it then looks for an escape which only comes by death. James 1:15 says, "Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." It brings forth death. So the world, it revels, it lavishes itself in endless sin. And sometimes it feels like it's never going to end. You know, the world does what it wants, whenever it wants, however it wants, and by whoever it wants for a limited time. Go ahead and turn to Job 21, because we kind of see a picture of this. And, you know, we see it in our world. You know, we kind of wonder, it's like, you know, when's it all going to come to an end? It just seems like it continues on and there's just no end in sight. And Job, he thought this. He had this same thought in his mind. But in Job 21, starting in verses 7 through 9, he says, "Why do the wicked still live? Continue on, also become very powerful. Their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and the rod of God is not on them." So he's like, why are they continuing on? It just seems like there is no end. And then jump down to verses 14 and 15. "They say to God, 'Depart from us. We do not even desire the knowledge of your ways. For who is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what would we gain if we entreat him? Behold, their prosperity is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me.'" So it just seems like it continues on. But he does get it. He answers his own question, going back to verse 13. "They will spend their days in prosperity, and suddenly they go down to Sheol." You know, Job's friends, if you remember them, they were pretty helpful, right? I mean, they helped Job out quite a bit, right? No, they did not. But there was one thing that his one friend did say, Zophar, and he says this in Job 20, verse 5, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless momentary. And you remember Asaph, he wrote quite a few psalms. You know, he came to this conclusion as well in Psalm 73, 18 through 19. "Surely you set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. How they are destroyed in a moment. They are utterly swept away by sudden terrors." This is the life of the wicked. They have pleasure for a moment, but destruction for eternity. And it is short-lived. You know, even though for us it seems like it's long-term, you know, we see all this stuff happening, but it is short-lived. It is but for a moment, and then they will be destroyed. They will be swept away by sudden terrors. And I even thought, you know, as we study Noah with the flood, you know, they didn't understand it until they were swept away, when it was too late. Same with Sodom and Gomorrah, when they were consumed by fire and brimstone. Suddenly, just like that, they were consumed. Now, getting back to the life of Moses, this doesn't mean that Moses was living in some immoral lifestyle, some gross immorality. But, you know, for him to stay and enjoy the pleasures of Egypt, that would be what? That would be disobedience against God for what God was calling him to do. It would be sin because he would be disobeying God's call for him. But by faith, Moses, it says what? Chose to endure ill treatment with the people of God. And there could be so much more said in that verse. I mean, you could spend just a whole time just looking at that verse in and of itself. But, you know, he rejected the pleasures of Egypt. And then in verse 26, back in Hebrews, it says, "Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." So the next choice of faith is in rejecting the world's possessions. Egypt was at its peak at this time. It had all the wealth, material goods that you would ever want or ever need. They had everything. And Moses, he had the treasures of Egypt up, when he reached 40 years old. He had it for 40 years. But he was about to give it up, considering the reproach of Christ as greater riches. Now, considering or esteeming, as the New King James has it, comes from the Greek word which signifies to lead. Then to lead before the mind, to suppose, consider, esteem. Considering involves careful thought and evaluation. Which has more weight? Which one is of greater riches? Now, the Christian's answer is obviously what? Christ. We'd say Christ is the greatest riches we could ever receive. While the world would be Egypt. It would be having what the Egypt has, the world has. But do we really understand this? Because it's not just Christ in and of himself, but it says the reproach of Christ. Suffering for Christ's sake. Is that truly our greater riches? For Paul it was. He wrote in Romans 8:18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." And Moses, he was the same way. John MacArthur commented by saying, Moses believed that the worst he could endure for Christ would be more valuable than the best of the world. Moses believed that the worst he could endure for Christ would be more valuable than the best of the world. And that's something that we got to keep in mind, I think, daily. Because we can easily get caught up with the things of this world, of this life. And none of us like suffering. But really, Christ, he told us we would. We would suffer for him. But you know what? That is greater riches than anything that the world can ever give us. And then it says the author adds an interesting phrase here of Moses. He says, considering the reproach of Christ. And what's interesting is Moses, he lived some 1,500 years before Christ even came. Now, there have been many suggestions, and commentators have said different things. But really, I believe what the text says here, that Moses suffered reproach for the sake of Jesus Christ. That's really what it says. Whether Old Testament saints or New Testament saints, all who suffer for God ultimately suffer for the sake of Christ. Then as we see in the last part of verse 26, it says, "For he was looking to the reward." So Moses, he wasn't set on temporary treasures of earth, but eternal treasures of heaven. Moses' reward was in heaven. His reward was Christ.
You see that in 2 Corinthians 4:16 and then the chapter. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal.
Very good, yeah. Yeah, Paul got it. Moses obviously got it. We must look past the things of this life and look eternally, heavenward. What truly is our reward, and it should be Christ. Christ is our ultimate reward.
He taught it in Matthew 6 also, 19 and 20.
Yeah.
They're casting out demons. So don't rejoice in that. Rejoice that you have your name in heaven.
Yeah. That's really what matters the most. And then we see in verse 27 the choice of faith in rejecting the world's pressure. The choice of faith in rejecting the world's pressure. So by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Now, fear is not only a certain feeling within us, it's a control factor over our whole being. Proverbs 29:5 says, "The fear of man brings a snare," and it really does. It trips us up, it entraps us. And it would be certainly understandable if Moses had fear, because he didn't have just some angry man after him. He had the wrath of the king against him. And we see that is because really after Moses killed the Egyptian, that he was really targeted as a dead man by Pharaoh. Exodus 2:15 says, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So though he could have been very fearful, he wasn't. And by faith, he left Egypt. I like how the King James Version says this, because it says, by faith, he forsook Egypt. And I really think that's even a better word. He didn't simply just leave it, he forsook it. He was forsaking it, not to return back. Everything he had, possessions, prominence, he was willing to let it go. Now, I think it's ironic that Israel, though they were afflicted, they were oppressed, they were in bondage, under Pharaoh in Egypt, they're the ones that kept saying about wanting to go back to Egypt. Yet Moses, not once, he never said he wanted to go back to Egypt. Yet he had everything in Egypt. He had everything, but he never wanted to go back. Now, just briefly, there are different views on which time is Hebrew speaking of here. Is it the first time he left Egypt or the second time? Because there's commentators that say, well, if it's the first time, it shows that he's kind of fleeing. He's fleeing from Pharaoh, and it looks like he's fearful. While the other one, he's marching out, he's leading Israel, and there's no sight of fear in him at all. Now, there's strong points in both cases. I think it's one of those things that you can't be too dogmatic. Now, you could say, well, looking at Hebrews, if it's the second time, then chronologically it's out of place. But I don't think that's really the main thing that we're looking at here. Either case, the point is that he left. He didn't want to go back. He was forsaking Egypt, and he didn't want to go back to it. That's really the main thing. It's not so much like if it was the first time or second time, but there is a lot of commentary on that. Then it says Moses, he did not fear the king of Egypt. He didn't fear the wrath of the king. Because it says not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. His eyes weren't set on the visible king, the earthly king, but the invisible, the eternal King of kings. That's where his eyes were fixed on. The invisible was more real to him than the physical. And then we see in verse 28, the choice of faith in accepting God's provision. The choice of faith in accepting God's provision. So verse 28, by faith he kept a Passover and the sprinkling of the blood so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. And as we know here, the 10th and final plague in Egypt was the most severe, for it claimed the lives of every firstborn, human or animal. And it wasn't until this plague, as you know, that Pharaoh decided to let the people go.
I think I mentioned this to you guys at Sunday school, but it always cracks me up when I read that story, because I just see Pharaoh, Moses, day after day, he's out by the Nile. I could just see him holding his staff. And then Pharaoh wakes up all tired, comes out to the river, and he looks up, and there's Moses staring at him. There's going to be a plague. I could just see Pharaoh.
Not you again. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure he was getting sick of seeing Moses every day. But we see this in Exodus chapter 11 and 12, and we won't read it all because there's a lot. But we will look at some of it. So if you turn to Exodus chapter 11. So Exodus chapter 11, and let me just read verse 1, and then we'll kind of break this down as we go. So chapter 11, verse 1 of Exodus says, now the Lord said to Moses, one more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely. So we see that this is going to be what it takes to let the people go. But then we see the details of this plague in verses 4 through 6. Moses said, thus says the Lord, about midnight I'm going out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, all the firstborn of the cattle as well. Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before, and such as shall never be again. So this was pretty massive, what was going to take place here. Pretty devastating. And though there would be great turmoil in the Egyptian camp, there would be tranquility in the Israeli camp. And we see that in verse 7. But against any of the sons of Israel a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast, that you may understand how the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. So though Israel would be protected, they had to follow God's provision and plan for them. And God, he gives detailed instructions to Moses and Aaron about the Passover in Exodus 12, 1 through 14. We won't read that whole passage, but to summarize it, really God, he gives the details of what they are to do. God gave them the month, the animal to select, how long until they killed it, what to do with the blood, when to eat it, how not to eat it, what to do with the leftovers, how to dress for the meal, what God was about to do in Egypt, and the significance of the blood. I mean, there's a lot. It was down to like every little detail. God, he provided for them what they were to do. And then Moses, after God spoke to him, he then spoke to the people concerning what God had said. So looking at verses 21 and 22, then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families and slay the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it into the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and the 2 doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning." He then reveals to them why this is important for them to do. Verse 23, "For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you." John Calvin, he comments on this. He says, it might have seemed strange that Moses should set a few drops of blood as a remedy in opposition to God's vengeance. But being satisfied with God's word alone, that the people would be exempt from the scourge that was coming on the Egyptians, he did not hesitate. And again, this is something that, I think we understand that the blood in and of itself did not save them. It was symbolic of Christ's blood, right? Which was shed for all of us. It was by faith and obedience in God's provision that saved them from destruction, just as faith in Christ alone saves us from eternal destruction. So what was the people's response to this? They could have said, "This is crazy. I'm not going to kill a lamb. I'm not going to smear blood over my door. I just painted it last week." No, they didn't say that. They could have said, "Well, forget about the blood. I'll lock the doors. I'll have men stationed there with sword and spear. And when this destroyer comes, we'll be ready for him." They did not say that. This was the people's reaction in verse 28. Verse 28 says, "Then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." So they obeyed. So then we see really the devastation of those who reject God's provision and plan. Verses 29 and 30. "Now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there is no home where there was not someone dead." I mean, that had to be quite a sight. Every house had a corpse in it. Every house had someone dead within it. Right. So there was no distinction, as it says there. No matter if you were on a throne sitting or in a dungeon, anyone who was not covered in the blood, whoever was the firstborn, died. It wasn't really a matter of God's provision here. It was a matter of whether they obeyed him or not.
Could you imagine the weight of that? Being Pharaoh, the weight of everybody in your entire, considered the world, right? It was the world.
Yeah.
Just pretty crazy to think about the amount of weight.
He's literally seen his kingdom crumble around him. But yet you see the hardness of his heart, the stubbornness of his unwillingness. And then we see back in our text in Hebrews 11, verse 29, we see the choice of faith in accepting God's promises. It says in verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land. And the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. So the final verse here, it captures the grand finale, the climax of the exodus from Egypt. Pharaoh, he let the people go, but he had a change of heart. So he gathered his men together, all his chariots, and in hot pursuit he chased after the people. And we see that in Exodus 14. And as the enemy drew near, the people became very frightened. And go ahead and turn to Exodus 14, a couple pages over. So the people, they're scared. And this is what they say to Moses in verses 11 and 12. Then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Wow. I mean, the people really did not demonstrate that much faith in their whole journey. They were characterized by unbelief most of their life. And here they are just leaving Egypt, and they want to turn back around and go back. They want to serve the Egyptians. No, they do not. They do not. And that's a spoiler alert, because they demonstrate unbelief more than faith, and this is just a preview of what's to come. So stay tuned. No, it's bad. It's drastic. I mean, they go through the waters, as we will see, but their faith is really limited. It's not really shown too much. On the other hand, Moses does demonstrate faith. And he said to the people in verses 13 and 14, but Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. So the people spoke, Moses spoke, then God spoke. Verses 15 and 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. As for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. So fear, it cowers back, but faith goes forward. And that's what God's calling the people to do. Go forward. Stop crying out to me. Move forward. So Pharaoh's army, nor the sea, were going to get in the way of God's promises to his people. And through the Egyptians, God would be honored. And by his power being displayed, he would be revered by his people. And let's go ahead and read this account in Exodus 14, 21 through 31. So starting in verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them, on their right hand and on their left. Then the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. At the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak. While the Egyptians were fleeing right into it, then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses.
Without social media, the people that they were eventually had to go take over the view of this great and mighty God.
Yep. But as you can see from the passage, both the Israelites and the Egyptians went through the Red Sea, but only one reached the shore. For Moses and the people, they went by faith and were delivered, while Pharaoh and his army went by presumption and were drowned. There are God's terms and then there are man's terms. Depending on the outcome that you want, only God's terms, which is by faith, will save. And of course we know Ephesians 2:8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith." So Moses, he is a great example of the choices of faith, which are made every day. And we have been seeing this again through our study. From the worship of faith, by Abel to the walk of faith, by Enoch to the work of faith, by Noah to the life of faith, by Abraham. It was all choices and decisions that had to be made. And again, those choices are often unpopular with the world. We may be hated. We may have to walk alone with no one beside us. We may be mocked and laughed at. We may look strange and foolish for leaving what we know and letting go of what we own. But if those choices and decisions are for God, and they draw us nearer to God, as we trust and obey him, then it doesn't matter if it makes sense, because it's worth it in the end. And those choices of faith are worth it in the end if it's going to lead us closer to God. So, that pretty much wraps up with what I got. Again, there's so much that can be covered in these verses. You could really go each week in just one of those verses at a time, but that kind of just gives you, that gives you a picture though of Moses and just the life of faith that he lived by the choices that he made.